Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Here on the Debrief, we catch up with experts from the intelligence and espionage community for a deeper look at the themes, events, and insights that fascinate them, taking you behind some of the world's most consequential, dangerous, and outlandish missions. During the Second World War, a ragtag group of individuals convened with one shared purpose: to create and distribute believable lies that would undermine enemy morale. The British propaganda vehicle known as the Political Warfare Executive used a network of radio stations to broadcast fake news across Europe. Journalist and broadcaster Terry Stiastny has written a new book about the organisation, Believable Lies: The Misfits Who Fought Churchill's Secret Propaganda War. Terry sat down with True Spies producer Morgan Childs earlier last month to talk about this lesser-known chapter in British history.
Terry, thank you for being here. My first question is a really simple one. I want to start at the very beginning. What was the Political Warfare Executive?
The Political Warfare Executive was a secret government organisation which operated in Britain during the Second World War. And what they were doing was essentially running radio propaganda that went from the UK into occupied Europe, countries like Germany, enemy and occupied countries, Italy, Yugoslavia, France, for instance. And what they were pretending to do, though, was that they were pretending to be people who were running resistance radio stations inside those occupied countries. So they were pretending that they were in Germany or that they were in Italy and that they were people who were opposed to the regimes there. And they were trying to spread propaganda in a kind of disguise to the people of the rest of Europe.
Terry, you are a seasoned journalist, but you have also written two other books, and they're works of fiction. And I'm sympathetic to any journalist who wants to slip into the world of fiction. But I'm curious how you decided to pivot this time around and take on this particular project.
Well, this book is about a lot of different things that I've always been interested in, I suppose. It's about journalism to a certain extent. It's about politics. It's about espionage. And really, this was an idea that I came across during lockdown. And I was listening to a piece on the radio, which included one of the people who went on to be one of my main characters, if you like, a woman called Elizabeth Barker. And she had worked for the BBC before and at the beginning of the Second World War, in the very early days of radio. And she also happened to be the woman who brought General de Gaulle into the BBC to record what later became his famous appeal to France in 1940. And I was sort of captivated by her voice and the way she told this amazing story about meeting a tall French general and taking him to the studio and all of the goings on around that. So I thought, anyway, she sounded a really interesting woman. And I wondered why during all of the years that I'd been at the BBC, I hadn't heard about her or her story. And she went on to have an interesting career in journalism after the war. And then as I researched more, I found out that not only did she have a career at the BBC, she also spent a lot of the war at this secret organisation, and that she went on to be one of the most senior women in the organisation. And the more I looked, the more I found that her colleagues were also really fascinating people. They came from all sorts of different backgrounds, and they all worked together, and they all didn't necessarily get on. They had feuds and they had political arguments, and they had very different ideas about what they were trying to do. And I thought, well, this is a great story, and it's a true story. It wasn't a novel, but it was just a fascinating thing to research and find out more about.
And what's the answer to that question? Why hadn't you heard more about it? I mean, I had the same question reading your book. Why haven't there been reams of books about this already?
I think it's interesting. I think partly we hear an awful lot about the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which started off as part of the same organisation and which separated out into the part of the organisation that carried out sabotage. So we hear a lot about the people who went behind enemy lines and carried out very daring daring expeditions. But we don't hear so much about the people in the other half of the organisation who did propaganda, probably because it's less, immediately dramatic. But they certainly believed that they were doing work that potentially saved lives. They were doing work that had an impact, they hoped, on the war effort. And, a lot of people came from all over Europe to work in this organisation. There were lots of women there were lots of exiles and refugees, and they were all living in these really unusual circumstances, partly in a stately home in the English countryside, not far from the more famous Bletchley Park, but also living in villages around there, living in sort of what they called the hush-hush village, where they weren't supposed to say, why are there sort of Germans and Italians and people from all over Europe living in this small English village, and they weren't allowed to talk to the locals about who they were or what they were doing.
Go back a bit to the sort of precursors of this organization. I understand that the British dropped leaflets over Germany during the First World War, and they promised things like fair treatment for soldiers if they surrendered and good rations. But what were the other precursors to the political war executive, and how did Britain take a sort of different tack during the Second World War?
Well, I think the main thing that had changed between the First World War and the Second World War was the technology. In the First World War, as you say, they had to drop leaflets over enemy lines using hot air balloons, and they were dependent for that message to get to the people they wanted to reach on the wind blowing in the right direction, because you had to drop leaflets of paper and hope that they landed with the people that you wanted to talk to. But obviously, once radio came into play during the 1920s, then you had a whole new technology that was opening up. And to be fair, Britain was quite slow to pick up on the uses that radio could be put to. If you compared it to what Germany was doing in the Nazi period, when Goebbels, the head of propaganda, realized that radio could be used as a massive means to reach loads of people in Germany and elsewhere. So Britain was essentially playing catch up once they got to that, and they had started doing radio broadcasts to the rest of the world in the 1930s via the BBC. But they had to develop these new radio stations, which were separate from the BBC, quite quickly and under wartime conditions.
Cold days, big ambitions, and absolutely no enthusiasm for chopping onions on a Tuesday night. If that sounds familiar, Factor makes healthy eating delightfully simple, with fully prepared meals designed by dietitians and crafted by actual chefs, so that you can eat well without the planning or the cooking. Take Factor's herb-roasted chicken with garlic green beans and cauliflower mash. It's ideal for this time of year. Warm, satisfying, but still properly balanced. Factor meals are built around quality, functional ingredients. Lean proteins, colourful vegetables, whole foods, and healthy fats. So if you're trying to eat a bit healthier, manage calories, or simply get more protein in without turning meal prep into a part-time job, Factor does the thinking for you. It's like having a dietitian and a chef quietly sorting the dinner in the background, while you get on with the rest of your life. Head to factormeals.com/TrueSpies50off and use code TrueSpies50off to get 50% off and free breakfast for a year. Eat like a pro this month with Factor. New subscribers only. Varies by plan. One free breakfast item per box for 1 year while subscription is active. Building a wardrobe that actually works usually isn't about having more clothes. It's about having better ones. Pieces that are versatile, well-made, and dependable enough to reach for again and again. That's very much the philosophy behind Quince. This all comes from the thoughtful approach Quince takes to how clothing is made. Quince works directly with safe, ethical factories and removes traditional middlemen, so the focus stays on quality fabrics and construction rather than heavy brand markups or expensive retail spaces. And so it's the little details people tend to notice. Their linen trousers manage to stay smooth and put together, avoiding that heavily wrinkled look, or that their lightweight cashmere sweaters stay looking fresh year after year. A wardrobe that works well isn't about having endless options. It's about having the right ones. Right now, go to quince.com/truespies for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's a full year to wear it and love it. And you will. Now available in Canada, too. Don't keep settling for clothes that don't last. Go to quince.com/truespies for free shipping and 365-day returns. quince.com/truespies.
You delineate the difference between so-called black and white propaganda early in the book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that difference for people who may not be familiar with it, and also, sort of define where the executive was situated on the border between those two.
What one of the people, Richard Crossman, who worked for the political warfare executive, often said about it was, he said, my left hand, which is the BBC, isn't supposed to know what my right hand of the political warfare executive is doing. So there were people who worked across both, but they tried to keep a distinction. So to come back to your first question, white propaganda was what they called the official propaganda put out by the government. So the kind of lines that the government would take, a speech by Churchill, for instance, something that could be broadcast over the official BBC radio and that was officially the voice of Britain, so to other countries and to their own people, of course. Black propaganda was something different. Black propaganda was something that was hiding its origins. It was pretending to be something that it wasn't. So it was pretending to be, for instance, the voice of a disgruntled German soldier sitting somewhere in a trench saying that their conditions were bad, their food was bad, that they felt that they were going to give up on things. And there were shades of black propaganda, I suppose you can say. Sometimes what they were doing was putting across true information, but just in this disguised fashion. And sometimes they were telling outright lies. So Sefton Delmer, one of the main proponents of black propaganda, said that what he was doing, and where the title of the books comes from, was detailed truths with believable lies. So he would make up stories, for instance, about how German rations were being stolen by the Nazi party elite and they were using the sugar to make their own birthday cakes. He would spread rumours about typhus being widespread in certain places around the country. He would make up gossip about the senior leadership of the Nazi party and their behaviour. And sometimes that had an element of truth to it. He said it was always more effective when it had an element of truth to it. But sometimes, these were lies, and they were using similar principles to what they have now, which is that if you tell a big enough lie about things that people are interested in, like their leaders' behaviour, their health, their food, that will get spread. That will go viral, as they wouldn't have said at the time, because that wasn't a term that was invented. But that was basically what they were trying to do.
Yes, as you mentioned, the title of the book comes from Muriel Spark, who is a well-known Scottish novelist and one of the authors of the executive's Black Propaganda. Can you tell me about some of the other sort of surprising figures who crop up in this story working for this organization?
Yes, Muriel Spark was recruited quite late on in the war. She had arrived, and she talks in her autobiography about how she went to see Sefton Delmer and she wasn't supposed to say about where she had come from. And she was recruited because they found somebody who said, "Oh, we hear you're interested in books and language, and would you like to go and work for a secret organisation?" Which she then did and worked out in the countryside for a while. She was taking information about bombing raids that had come in from the RAF and then passing those on to her colleagues. So she was someone who went on to obviously a brilliant career afterwards. And there were many others. Richard Crossman, for instance, he worked on the German service, both at the PWE and at the BBC beforehand. He went on to be a Labour MP and then eventually a cabinet minister. Elizabeth Barker, who I've already mentioned, was a journalist who went back into journalism and travelled around Greece and other countries during the 1940s and beyond. Sefton Delmer, he was a really fascinating character. He had been the Daily Express's correspondent in Berlin before the war. He'd got to know a lot of the people in the Nazi hierarchy and written about that before he eventually managed to get himself recruited to doing secret work. Robert Bruce Lockhart, he was the boss of all of them. He had also written books himself. He was a journalist and had been a secret agent. He had been taken prisoner during the Russian Revolution and imprisoned in the Kremlin. He was then released in a kind of hostage swap. So he had an amazing and fascinating, quite rackety life. And last but not least, Brendan Bracken, who was the politician in charge of the organisation. He was the Minister of Information. He was very close politically with Winston Churchill and often had the ear of the Prime Minister. But in terms of lies, he was one of the people, even compared with current politicians, who lied more about his own personal life than most people in public life today. In a way they probably couldn't have got away with. He lied about where he came from, where he'd been born, about his family, and then about his entire personal circumstances. But actually, when it came down to discussing whether they should use truth or lies in propaganda, actually had quite a sophisticated understanding of when lies worked and when they didn't.
Can you say more about that? What was that understanding?
He knew when to push things. I mean, Brendan Bracken was very good at talking to journalists. He'd been a journalist himself, so he knew that world very well. But he also knew when you might not get away with things. So, for instance, during the invasion of Italy, there was a plan which had gone right the way up to the desks of Winston Churchill and of Roosevelt to say, perhaps we should put out a fake broadcast which claims to be from the King of Italy, saying that the war is essentially over, that I have surrendered, that all the Italian troops should give in. And they were just going to put this out in the name of the Italian king when that wasn't true at all. And initially Churchill and Roosevelt thought, well, this is a great idea. It might get the Italians to surrender ahead of time. It might save lives. It might, benefit our troops on the ground. And Bracken, amongst others, turned to Churchill and said, if this doesn't work, we are in enormous trouble, because if it is shown that this is a false statement, that the king never said any such thing, and if the invasion doesn't go well, then no one will believe anything that Britain has to say about the course of the war for the foreseeable future. And as one of Churchill's other advisors said, I see no danger in a good bouncing lie, but just not one that will bounce in our own direction.
This fabulous mix of personalities and backgrounds reminds me, and we spoke a few weeks ago with Robert Hannigan about his new book, Counterintelligence, which discusses in great detail the really diverse mix of backgrounds that were represented by the people at Bletchley Park. You used the term misfits in your title, and I wondered if you could talk about that choice of words and what it was about this work that required such a mix of skill sets.
Yes, I think they were misfits. I think they were mostly not people that would have passed any kind of modern vetting check. For instance, quite a lot of them had, to be frank, an absolute drink problem. They were sort of working late hours. They were out sort of living a life as well. So they were not all team players. They managed to work together to a certain extent, but someone like Richard Crossman, for instance, was an incredibly argumentative person. He had been a philosopher by training. He was a politician. He was someone that just loved to have an argument for the sake of having an argument, as long as he could win it. And Brendan Bracken, similarly, was quite, liked to drink, liked to have a good debate, had huge feuds with one of the other ministers, Hugh Dalton, another Labour minister who had been involved in the organisation in its early days, to the extent that they were swearing at each other in public places, and they had to get Churchill in to come and resolve the debates between them because they just couldn't settle it. And interestingly, now this would mostly come out in public, obviously in a wartime era when you had censorship and when you didn't have the means to spread gossip and rumours in quite the same way we can now. People didn't hear so much about it. But you needed a lot of different skill sets. So Bruce Lockhart and Crossman said, it's good having journalists working on this kind of propaganda. So Sefton Delmer in particular, he was someone from what we'd now call tabloid journalism. He knew what people wanted to listen to. And it's no point having your radio propaganda if people think this is dull and they switch it off. And what Delmer said, particularly about the BBC, is he said, this is worthy, this is boring. If you are actually, a German soldier or a submariner sitting under the ocean managing to pick something up on the radio, you've got to have something that keeps you listening. And one of the tactics that they used to do this was to play lots of music, lots of the kind of music that was banned, particularly in Germany. So they'd play popular songs, they played jazz. This also gave them cover as well, because if you were a submariner or a soldier sitting somewhere in France or under the Atlantic, you could say, oh, well, I had no idea this was a foreign propaganda station. I just listened to it because it had some good music on it. I'm terribly shocked to discover that I've been listening to foreign propaganda all along, because, of course, your listeners could potentially be punished for listening to foreign radio if that's what they knew it was.
There are also some really shocking uses of propaganda in the book, and I wonder if there were any in particular that really caught you unawares in the research process.
There was one that I had read about in some of the secondary sources, because there were quite a few memoirs written, after 30 years or so after the war, when people could say a little bit about what had gone on. And you didn't really hear the full story until quite a lot later. But I think my favourite story, and it was one when I almost kind of squeaked with delight when I found the actual letter in the archive that people had referred to kind of obliquely, is the story about the so-called Admiral's Orgy. So there was a British minister called Sir Stafford Cripps, who was extremely puritanical, extremely straight-laced. He was teetotal, he was vegetarian, he didn't like anything that was sort of perceived to be immoral. And he had been told about a broadcast which described in very vivid terms for radio, that's probably as far as I go, a German admiral was having an orgy with a variety of people involved, and Sir Stafford Cripps had somehow got to hear about this, even though he wasn't supposed to have heard about it, because it was supposedly only broadcast in German and only in a way that he couldn't have heard in the UK. And he was really upset that Britain was using pornographic propaganda, and he's reported to have said, if this is the way we're going to win the war, well, I would rather lose it. And the letter that I found in the archive was him writing by hand to Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary. And he sort of said, my dear Anthony, you will soon understand why I have to write this letter myself in hand, because I can't allow my lady typist to hear what I'm talking about. So I'd heard reference to this letter, and to actually see the letter, which has only relatively recently been released, this handwritten letter expressing exactly how upset he was and exactly how rude the radio broadcast had been, was a great moment.
Yes, it made me blush in reading the book, and I can only imagine in the early 40s what a shock it might have been. The one that really surprised me and also made me chuckle was about the use of astrology. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, this also I found fascinating, and I felt a little bit sorry for the person who was involved in this. There was a chap called Louis de Vol, and he was a Hungarian astrologer who had come to Britain as a refugee and wanted to help the war effort. And because they rightly believed in the UK that a lot of the Nazi hierarchy were very interested in astrology and the occult, and they thought, well, this is great. We will try and use this in our propaganda. And at one point they wanted to have a radio station that was specifically devoted to astrology and the occult, and they would supposedly, communicate with people from beyond the dead and so forth. But it never actually got on air, because every time they tried to record their broadcasts, the woman who was supposed to be reading out these messages just kept bursting out laughing, and she couldn't actually get as far as keeping a straight face to do all of this. But poor Louis de Vol arrived in London. He was recruited to try and write horoscopes that would predict terrible futures for basically the Nazi hierarchy. So he would say, Capricorn, you're going to lose the Battle of Stalingrad, or whatever it was. So, and he would backdate some of his predictions to make it look like the things that he had said had come true. But then he was just dropped at one point by some of the people within the organisation, and they didn't tell him where they'd moved their offices to, they didn't tell him where he'd gone, they didn't tell him why they weren't using him anymore. And so the poor chap had to be found another job, because they said he hasn't got a ration book, he hasn't got a permit to stay in the country, and we don't want him to end up in court. So you've got to find something for him to do within the political warfare executive that allows him to stay in the country legally, because otherwise we've got a rogue astrologer wandering around talking to people at seances and saying that he's been working for a secret organisation.
Yeah, no, never good. This propaganda was so tailored to its audience, as you've already suggested. And I'd love to hear you talk about the sort of research that the group was carrying out across enemy lines to get a good sense of what the conditions were and what the morale was like at that time.
Yes, this was a really important aspect of their work. There was quite a lot of intelligence behind it. So I mentioned the RAF giving them information on bombing raids and on where had been destroyed. They worked very closely with naval intelligence, so the places that Ian Fleming worked, for instance, to try and find out more about, say, where German submarines were, what was going on with shipping. But the main reason they needed to have this accurate intelligence, down to people who knew the whole train network of Germany and where the train network was going and would be able to talk about things like that, is because if you could tell that they were basing their broadcasts on very old information, so information that had come with people who'd fled Germany, say in the early or late 1930s, if you didn't know that, the local church in a particular town you were talking about had been bombed to smithereens, it would show that your information was out of date and therefore people would be more likely to know that it was fake. So there was a very close relationship there with intelligence, and they would also rely quite a lot on the interrogations of prisoners of war, both in camps within Europe, prisoners of war who had been brought over to the UK, and on bugging information from people who had been held in Britain as prisoners who thought that they were just talking quietly amongst themselves, were also being listened to, and that kind of information was then fed into the system as well. So they were trying as much as they could to get not only factual information, but also gossip, who knew whom, who was seen as being corrupt, who was seen as taking more rations, for instance. And they knew that they'd got a hit in propaganda terms when they would make a claim about someone and the person was forced to deny it. So they talked about one man who they said, he overindulges, he drinks too much, he takes more than his fair share of the rations. And when that man then went on German radio to say, no, this is outrageous, I am a normal consumer like anybody else, they knew that, somebody is listening to this.
Baseball is back, and the first pitch is on Netflix. The New York Yankees, led by seven-time All-Star Aaron Judge, head to the San Francisco Bay to take on Rafael Devers' San Francisco Giants. This season kicks off with one exclusive opening night game. Watch MLB Opening Night, the New York Yankees versus the San Francisco Giants, live on Netflix. Wednesday, March 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
Walmart Business is in the business of saving you time, money, and hassle. Whether your business started in a garage or is a garage, Walmart Business has the tools to help you get where you're going. Tools like free shipping, multi-user accounts, and just about any item your company needs.
Even a double filtration cyclone dust collector.
Yep, even that.
Sweet.
Walmart Business. It's the Walmart you love. Now for your business. Learn more at business.walmart.com. Terms apply.
There are a lot of politics in this book, and you've already made mention of the fact that there is a lot of arguing happening behind closed doors. And I wonder if you think that that speaks to the really unique circumstances within this organization or this war, or in general, if you think that there's more disagreement within these sort of covert operations than spy fiction or even the general historical record would tend to suggest.
I think that things like this have probably always gone on. If you look at, say, British politics over the last period when I was writing this, so from 2020 on, it's often happened that people's WhatsApps, people's private messages have been released into the public domain. And you realise that they are often putting up a front and saying we're all in agreement on this policy. And the messages that are then released, and it's happened quite a few times now in recent history, show that, of course, they're absolutely not. They have to say one thing for public consumption, and they are often having absolute furious fights behind closed doors. And I think it's part of Britain's myth of the Second World War, if you like, that this was a time when everybody pulled together in the national interest, that everybody was in agreement, that there was an agreement across political parties. And of course, yes, there was to a certain extent. Of course, they managed to get things done and to win the war ultimately. But that doesn't mean that they weren't, really debating why they were doing what they were doing, what was the best way to achieve things. And sometimes that was policy and strategy, and sometimes that was personal.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the dissolution of the Political Warfare Executive, and you write a bit about the Information Research Department, which was the Foreign Office's Cold War propaganda arm, which was closed in the 70s. How did the argument surrounding the morality of this work evolve as we entered into the Cold War and the later half of the 20th century?
Yes, what happened almost immediately after the end of the war is that there was a feeling that political warfare, and in particular black propaganda, was something that was only suitable for a time of war, that there wasn't a justification to carry this kind of operation on into peacetime. And partly that was because there was a change of government. You'd had the national government and you got a Labour government who came in and said, we are going to do some things differently. And partly they just said, this was something that we need to leave behind in the past. But then what happened little over sort of 2 years later is that as the Cold War started to intensify, and it was literally a government minister who travelled back from the United Nations on the boat from New York and said, given what I've seen the Russians doing in terms of propaganda, and he was someone who had worked in the PWE in a junior capacity himself, he said, we can't let the Russians be doing all of this and us not do it. And so he convinced Ernest Bevin, the then Foreign Secretary, that they should revive some kind of operation like this. And they actually went back to quite a lot of the people who had worked there during the war and said, well, would you like to come back? They went back to Bruce Lockhart, they went back to Elizabeth Barker and said, would you like to sign up again, effectively? And they said no, mostly, but some people who had worked in that organisation said, we will sign up. But interestingly, one of the things they said is we mustn't call it political warfare and we mustn't call it black propaganda. And also we mustn't tell some of the people who were involved in propaganda in the war, such as Richard Crossman, who was by then an MP, for example, that we're doing this again because we believe that they won't want to revive it, that they thought that it was ultimately wrong to be telling lies and that the best way of winning the war sort of psychologically was to tell the truth. But it certainly carried on to quite a great extent up until the 1970s. They did a lot of information warfare in the Middle East, for instance, in Africa and elsewhere. So this was certainly, still a significant and secret operation.
You use the term fake news throughout the book, and I would love to know about your decision to use that particular term.
Yes, I mean, I suppose, there is an obvious parallel between what was going on then and what we see going on now in terms of sort of influence operations. Lots of people are trying to do it. And I think by looking back at the origins, I know fake news is a term that has been overused and abused, to a certain extent, when you look at people wanting to cancel some story by just shouting out and calling it fake news, that's obviously an overuse of it. But I think if you look closely at what we are getting internationally now in terms of influence operations, I suppose, and propaganda operations, they use exactly the techniques that Sefton Delmer and his colleagues would have recognised. They say, tell people untrue stories about their health and the health of people around them, about their leaders and what their leaders might be up to behind closed doors, about things that worry them, like whether their food is safe, for instance, about scandals. And you rely on that kind of information spreading fast through a population. Now, the only difference really is the technology. In the Political Warfare Executive, they could use radio, they could use leaflets, they couldn't use much beyond that. And I think if you were able to go up to Sefton Delmer now and say, look, everybody in the world pretty much carries in their pocket, in their hand, the ability to create what you had to have several radio stations in the English countryside to do. We can spread this information as quickly as you like, instantly, and everybody could do it. He would recognise what you were doing. He would just be astonished and amazed by the ability of everybody, good or bad actors, to be able to produce that and spread it.
That's a perfect place to end, although I have one more question I'd like to ask you. Plenty of people who objected to the idea that Britain should spread these deliberate lies, and people who were really concerned that would damage the country's reputation in the long run. I wonder if you think that fear was unfounded?
I think the fear was pretty well-founded. And I tell the story in the book of how Richard Crossman, and he was with Bill Paley as well, his American colleague, was present at the liberation of Dachau, the concentration camp. And he was there on VE Day, just as the war was ending in Europe. And he is reported to have said to his colleagues, as he saw all the absolute horrors, he said, "One day people will say that this never happened." And, he was taking down absolute details and trying to be sure of the absolute factual truth in order that people could never say that this didn't happen. And I think that was one of the real dangers of black propaganda, because particularly when you were looking at what was going to happen, even just in the next 10 years, Britain and its allies were going to be occupying Germany. They were going to have to tell the German population the truth about what their own government had done, and they needed people to believe it. And I think, if it had been widely known that Britain had been putting out fake and untrue news throughout the war, then people would have had less reason to believe, what their own government had done and how they had murdered people and all the dreadful things that had happened. So I think, ultimately it is better in the long run to stick to telling people the truth and to hope that your country and what it says can be trusted.
Thank you, Terry. It's really interesting stuff, and I'm so glad you were here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this chat between Terry Stiastny and True Spies producer Morgan Childs. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?